such as why we're here, what's the point. We essentially doubt ourselves by realising that we can think. Science, philosophy and religion are all born out of our own self-consciousness. And this critical thought, and critical thought essentially, which brings me on to my final point, which I think is the most important thing that separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom, and that's language. Now, I've been trying to decide what came first, language or self-consciousness. I've tried to look it up, but it seems we know very little about the origin of language. So to start, let me explain the difference between language and communication in other species. In various species of ape, we can hear animals communicate with one another. In fact, in a wide range of species, we can hear animals communicate through gestures and hoots and howls, etc. And this is evident, like I say, in a lot of animals. The difference between language as we use it today and gestures, howls, hoots as a tool for communication is that we use the guidelines of language to creatively construct sentences and articulate ourselves. This is something that most of the animal kingdom doesn't do. Animal communication is very much tied to their emotions. You see a predator, you need to warn others. It's not a conscious decision. It's you have this emotion of fear. You make a noise that translates to everyone else. So you can essentially, you can teach a chimp sign language, but the chimp doesn't have a creative process when it comes to signing. It's a learned behaviour the animal uses to get a desired result. This isn't an abstract dialogue. It's all very in the moment. You know, an animal needs food. They'll communicate with you that they need food, but they're not going to, you know, discuss the complexities of Shakespeare or something like that. Anyway. So like I said, this isn't an abstract dialogue. Now, a human example, I watched a documentary the other night where a child was being taught nonsense words, essentially. So they showed the child a picture of a man hanging upside down. And the presenter said to the child, "This man beans." Bean being the nonsense word that they've made up and taught to this child. Now, essentially, they taught the child the new word on camera, bing, and used it to refer to the man on a flashcard who's hanging upside down. You know, they said that Bing is hanging upside down. But they didn't explain this, they just said this man bings. They then said to the child, if this man's job is to bing, what is his job? And the child thought for a sec, and they said, he's a binger. After a little hesitation, they said he's a binger. Now, what happened there was a creative process by which the general guidelines of language were understood by the child, and then they used that to articulate a sentence that could be understood. The important thing to recognise is that the term binger was never taught to the child. What happened was you've got the ER, the suffix at the end, which the child has already used in everyday language, and then you've got the word bing, and they've put it together. This is something that animals don't do. Animals don't teach themselves new words, they don't teach themselves new signs. And in the deaf community, sign language does evolve. They make up new signs, it spreads, it evolves essentially. With animals, it's not a creative process. They don't just pick up on the guidelines and then make up words, which, as I saw from that documentary, very young children can do. Another example in the same programme was where a young child had messy hands, and the only relevant terms that the child had in their vocabulary was yucky and all gone. Obviously, they know what yucky is, and all gone when they're eating their food and it's all gone, they've picked that up. So when the child wanted to wash his hands, he didn't have any correct relevant sentence. So he just said, all gone yucky. And the parent washed his hands and he was happy. So what he's done is he's articulated a sentence based on separate words that would fit together. Another thing that animals would not do. So this articulation is something that other species don't have the ability to do, and it's what makes language so key to humanity. Now, I'll go back to that in a sec, but if we look at the brain, we can see the most complicated system on our planet, consisting of over 100 billion neurons interconnected in a myriad of ways. We have a motor area, a sensory area, we have a frontal lobe, which is home to our personality and our centre for conscious thought, an area for speech, an area for language and perception, and that's not an all-encompassing list. I'm just, reading out things, basically. So our brain and our central nervous system deals with every action our body makes, voluntary or involuntary, and every thought that occurs in our mind, consciously or unconsciously, all stems from the brain and the central nervous system. Now, aside from being a useful communication tool, language actually gives our brains a boost. There are physical changes that occur during early growth. I'll make another quick point. There's a mutated gene within the human species that is theorised to give the abilities. That's theorised to give humans the ability to form language. However, language is not instinctual. By having this gene, you don't automatically know language. What this does is it gives you the guidelines. It gives you the ability to learn different languages. And essentially, I'll use this example. You can take a child from England and raise it in, say, China. Then in 20 years, the person would not instinctually know English just because it was born from English parents. He would learn Chinese, and if he hadn't learned English, then he wouldn't know English at all. Which shows that language is taught, which means the physical changes that occur in the brain actually occur due to a social aspect. There's not, there's not a gene that just makes your brain change and makes these other areas produce. It's a social aspect. We are essentially. Sorry.
It's brought out by the humans.
Exactly, it's brought out by the humans and the fact that we communicate with one another. I was talking to Alex the other day, and he mentioned Aristotle said that man is a political animal, and I think these physical changes that have a social cause act as evidence of this, because it's like I said, social things that lead to a physical change. Now, during the French Revolution, a feral child was found and taken in by a scientist. Now, feral children, for those who aren't familiar, are children who are raised away from any human contact. Generally, they've been abandoned in the wild. Rudyard Kipling, Mowgli, that kind of thing. They're raised. Well, they're not always raised with animals, but
Romulus
they're raised.
And Remus.
Yeah, Romulus and Remus. They're raised away from human contact, and they're very interesting to study. In the case of this feral child in France, the scientist tried to teach the child to speak, but he never achieved this task. And nowadays, scientists would say that the child was too old and there was little, what they call neuroplasticity in the brain, which essentially helps you learn new things. If the child were to learn a language at a young age, different areas of the brain will be activated, leading to an exponential rate of learning, as modern humans that are raised by other humans, they show this at a certain age of growth where they learn the language. They start learning all sorts of new things very quickly. I believe it's 10 words a day that children actually learn nowadays. Now, later cases of feral children that come up, they've had the ability to perform brain scans on these children, which gives an interesting insight. Which leads me on to actually, there's a quick myth I want to debunk while we're here, is we only use 10% of our brains.
Oh, yeah.
Well, this is Hollywood logic that kind of gives way to, psychic abilities and supernatural phenomena. And I mean, when I was young, I used to say to myself, like, if we used our whole brain, maybe we'd have different abilities and different, maybe psychic abilities. But the brain scans of these feral children do well to debunk this myth, because the parts of the brain that are not used, like the language centre, they show up as grey areas on the scan. And these areas of the brain, they simply shut down. So when it comes to the brain, it seems to be a use it or lose it case. If 90% of the brain is not used, then 90% of the brain just shrinks down and you don't see it, essentially. So after so much time, go back to the French Revolution case, it became impossible to bring those shut down areas of that child's brain to a working level, essentially. So, okay, I was trying as best I could to think of an analogy, right?
Language and analogy.
Language and analogy. Okay. Anyway, I was trying my best to think of one while I was at work the other day, and it's very abstract. So, here we go. Imagine you have a giant pie, which has elasticated edges, right? So you've got a big pie. Bear with me, it's a bit of a strange abstract one. Now, the contents of the pie is split into 6 portions. You've got 6 flavours in this elasticated pie. Now, you've got apple, blueberry, cherry, and 3 other flavours that you can think of that I can't right now. So, imagine, because the sides are elasticated, you can keep adding to this pie over time. And it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and you can just keep adding to it, make it bigger. So it grows. Now, you've got this 6 flavoured pie, but if you run out of the 5 flavours, and say you just got cherry, and you think, fuck it, you just keep making the pie bigger, you keep adding cherry. So anyway, you keep adding cherry to this 6 flavoured pie, it grows and it grows. And what happens is, the proportion of cherry to other flavours increases significantly. And if you do this hundreds of times, thousands of times, or millions of times, and then say I give you a slice of my pie that I've been adding cherry to for the last thousands of years, what flavour would you say it was?
Pie.
Right, well I'll jump in and give you an answer.
Okay.
I surmise...
Sorry, you caught me off guard there. It's like, fuck, you're talking to me. Yeah, go on. I don't know, blueberry.
Right.
I didn't know there'd be audience participation.
No, I know, I didn't actually intend to, but... Okay, so...
I reckon your flavour would be blueberry.
Right.
Don't know why.
Because you're
But
not
I'll go
paying
with
attention.
Let's bring it back to the analogy then, seeing as
Okay.
you weren't paying attention. You've got a pie of 6 flavours, you've run out of 5 flavours, you just keep adding cherry.
Right.
The pie grows as you add to it,
Yeah.
and then eventually, after 1,000 years,
You turn
I've added
up.
so much cherry, I'll
Right.
give you a slice of it. What flavour pie do you say it was?
Well, it would be cherry flavoured because your
Yeah.
shit wouldn't matter. really.
Exactly.
Okay,
So you'd say it's a
Right.
cherry pie.
Okay.
Everyone else would assume this is a cherry pie. Now, obviously at first you'd get a hint of other flavours, but after so long you'd only be able to taste cherry. And like I said, this is a bit abstract, but one of the biggest arguments against revolution and system change is that humans are just naturally selfish and bad. Now, a system change or a revolution would just decay into violence because human nature, just pushes it that way. And there are many other negative mindsets who believe that humanity will always decay into violence no matter what. And this is the idea that humans are naturally violent and just horrible. It's the same idea that the pie we're talking about is a cherry pie. Humans have this amazing brain that acts like a sponge. We absorb so much information and we learn and we adapt. But look at the modern day information we have. It's all rooted in capitalism. Any alternative is not given a fair and accurate representation, generally. Our current global class system of oppression brings out these less desirable characteristics. Selfishness, narrow-mindedness, or some of the other characteristics that are found in human nature and found in nature in general, like altruism and collectiveness, they're pushed back or they're dismissed because human nature doesn't allow it, which, is rubbish. History has been manipulated by the winners of wars to give us a jaded view of the world, and this is the act of putting too much cherry in our metaphorical pie, emphasising too much violence within nature and applying it to ourselves, anthropomorphising it. When it comes to human nature, it is true that violence begets more violence. Serial killers and such generally have a history of violent experience. Maybe not all, but in general that is the theme. You're abused as a child, you go on to abuse others. What we then see is that people who have positive experience of violence, i.e. they use violence to get their own way and it's successful, they continue to be violent when they feel necessary. We also see from statistics that children who are disciplined physically are much more likely to be violent in their adult lives. Luckily, there doesn't seem to be too much evidence of this passing down genetically. Just like an English-born child can learn Chinese instead of English, it it's these different material conditions that are essentially making the child learn Chinese instead of English. And a newborn baby, despite the history of violence that probably is in all of our lineages at one point, if brought up without violence, can curb this kind of attitude that violence is a good, is something that can be used to get what you want. Another thing that we talk about human nature is a tendency towards disorder. There's a tendency towards disorder within physics, and we know this, but people translate this to humanity, and they assume that we will always head towards a chaotic end. Another thing that's been pushed by certain religious scriptures. But I mean, if we look throughout history, there's a positive tendency towards less oppression and better conditions. And I could give a whole talk of examples, but I don't really think this is one of the main arguments people use, because the people who are using these arguments don't really know that much about physics. So the tendency towards disorder is it's not something I'm going to focus on really. So instead, I'm going to talk about the dark side, which everyone likes to talk about. So people refer to the dark side of human nature, generally speaking about this idea of evil. Personally, I don't believe in absolute good or evil. I think it's all subjective. But this polarisation is drilled into us from a very early age. Even if you're not religious, we weren't brought up with a... Well, to be fair, most religions have a good and evil polarity. But I mean, if you weren't brought up, say, pagan, where it's just action and consequences, most religions have this, this good and evil state. But even if you're not brought up religious, or if you're brought up in pagan or completely atheist, we've got television and Hollywood pushing these ideas of good and evil. Sometimes very subtly, and sometimes very obviously. I want to define this idea of a dark side right now, because, redefine, sorry, did I say redefine? Because I believe it's not the presence of this so-called evil that creates a darker side of human nature. It's just the absence of light, because essentially that's all the dark is. The dark is just an absence of light. Now, when people are not raised with light shining on all aspects of the brain, and by light I mean stimulation, these darker traits emerge. I'm not saying that these undesirable traits are only in less intellectual people, but perhaps less emotionally intelligent people or mentally scarred people. This is where we see these aspects of what most people call evil. And these people are not evil in a sense, they're just damaged. And it's our society that does the damaging, because these are the traits that we pull out of people. So, Ben, you got me onto this bit actually. I want to make a point here about psychopathy, because Ben brought up the other week that 1 in 10 people have psychopathic tendencies. Now, there isn't a genetic makeup that causes any one person to be defined as a psychopath. True, there are dispositions that make it more likely, but it's not merely a genetic cause. You don't just, you have a child born and you can test for it and he's just a psychopath. It doesn't work that way. And I think this is another sort of false consciousness that is drilled into people. The diagnostic tool for giving a person a label of a psychopath is merely a checklist of traits that they go through. If you show so many of these traits, I think it's 5 out of 7, you're a psychopath. Now, I was going to bring in the list, but believe me, if I bring it up on screen, you're all going to read 1 or 2 and just think, no, that applies to me. And then you'll spend too much time thinking you're a psycho. But in reality, once you read that checklist, nothing in your life has changed. Either you fill some of the profile, you don't, realising it, it's just, nothing's changed, really. And I think people spend too much time thinking about this sort of thing. So, okay, I'll give you a quick thing. When I was put in prison, I was given a lot of time to think about the same conundrum, to see psychologists and psychiatrists, which really made me think about it too much. When it came to my release, I was given an interview with a member of the MAPPA team, which is basically a multi-agency team that evaluates whether you can go out into the world safely. And they give you a score based on how likely you are to offend again. And I asked this lady who was scoring me a few questions about the system, about the scoring system.
Mine was 79% in the first 2 years.
Shooting.
So when I was asking her these questions,
Go on.
the first thing she told me was, well, you have a capacity to be violent, so that's one mark against you.
Oi.
And I said, well, I told her, well, everyone on this planet has a capacity to be violent. That's a ridiculous statement. And her response was, yeah, but you've been violent before, so it's more likely. Now, I mean, I stopped asking questions because I wanted to be released. So I jumped through the general hoops of conversation to show I was a reformed character. And yeah, it made me think a little bit. Because this label you give them once you go through a hard time, convict, criminal, violent, this says nothing about the character of the person and serves only those who want to judge you, really. This judgment can then have a reactive effect. And I didn't actually pull up statistics on this, but I'm 99% you can just look it up. People who have this label put on them, it makes them less connected with the rest of the society, and it makes them more inclined to have these antisocial traits, or just reoffend, or just carry on being criminals. Just fuck it, everyone thinks you're a criminal anyway. You might as well just do whatever. So let's go back to the psychopathic question. Robert Hare, he was the man who invented the psychopathic diagnostic tool that's used to point out the psychos in the world. And he was once asked the question, why are there so many psychopathic people in the world? And his answer was that capitalism rewards the traits needed to be a psychopath. So someone the other week said, what about people who are just psychos? How do we deal with them if it comes to a revolution? Well, with a global revolution, we may not even need to answer that question. Because if the man who invented the psychopath checklist is blaming capitalism for the presence of psychopaths, then I don't really think we have much to worry about. And I think this idea that people are just naturally evil, or the Catholic idea that everyone is born with original sin, it's just something that's drilled into us so much that we start to believe it. And I think that I think that it does more harm than good, to be honest.
Well, if you've got everybody at their throats, then it's quite easy to rule, isn't it?
One more thing I want to talk about is this question of criminality that I've already touched on slightly. The line of criminality is defined by the ruling class. One day I think we probably will, but one day we may all be criminals just by being here and congregating like this and sharing ideas. And does this make us bad people? No, it just means we're not apathetic and we think critically. We need to abandon the idea that criminality automatically makes people wrong. And I put this in here because a few weeks ago, I can't remember who it was, but there was a couple of people who kind of had this idea of, but what about the criminals in a global revolution? But we need to abandon this idea that criminality automatically makes people wrong, because for future generations it can be confusing. Attitudes towards criminals in this world is atrocious. People who smoke weed, people who occupy, people who fight police to protect their friends at protests, they're all labelled criminals quite easily, and then they're all very easily judged for it. It's a liberally used term to devalue those who speak against the system, and the laws are constantly changing, they're constantly redefined to put more people under the banner of criminal, when in fact the majority of people would view many of the things that happen in Parliament, they'd see that as criminal and immoral, and go one step further. So criminality doesn't always correlate with morality and integrity. And in fact, history has shown us that those with more integrity are punished quite more severely. So I think Nelson Mandela's probably an example of that. So, I was going to wrap up, but there's another thing that I've actually missed off my talk. I think that's one of the problems with modern psychology as well, is everyone is drawn to this dark side, these criminals, these psychopaths and everything, which makes the whole of the psychological field subjective, because everyone's looking for these psychopathic traits. I watched a talk where a guy went to visit, I can't remember what he'd done actually, but he was in Broadmoor, and they said that he was crazy, and this man went to see him and interviewed him, and the man came out and he wasn't crazy, he was very normal looking. He held a conversation, they talked for hours. And they said, oh, why are you here? And they said, oh, well, at first they said I was crazy, and what I did is I didn't want to go to prison, so I acted crazy. And they said, okay, you're crazy, you get put in a thing. And then he realised that Broadmoor's a lot worse place to go than prison. So he thought, oh, well, I'll go back to normal, I'm not crazy. And then all they did is said, well, you acted crazy, you must be a psychopath. We're not releasing you. So psychologists, well, a lot of psychology students are now, they have this obsession with like the darker side. And it makes the whole view subjective because they're looking for that. They don't see this pie analogy that I'll go back to again because I really like it.
Right.
They don't just see a whole pie that's given so much cherry that it's become a cherry pie. All they see is a cherry pie. They see someone as a psychopath. They don't see every other aspect of their personality. They don't see every aspect of their mind or brain. All they want to see is what they're picking out.
Right.
And I think that with the darker side of humanity, as we've mentioned, this is what it is. It's society and capitalism picking out certain parts. And as Robert Hare said, capitalism rewards psychopathic traits. So I'm going to wrap up, and I need to provide an alternative to the whole human nature is violent and selfish argument, because I can't get up here and say all of their arguments are crap and then not provide an alternative. What is human nature? So this concept of human nature, I believe, is biased, and it's in line with the view of the ruling class in order to sway attitudes within the masses of people and the masses of thinkers as well, which sometimes makes it even more dangerous. One thing is apparent in human nature, within human nature, is trust, believe it or not. The masses throughout history have trusted religion, and we saw in that slave film last week how scripture was used to indoctrinate and oppress people. We see with the military-industrial complex, the working class people indoctrinated into this mode of thinking, this good and evil, to justify war. Because essentially when you go to war, or when these people go to war, they don't have this complex view of a political system. It's more of an us and them. It's they're bad, we're good. Let's kill them sort of thing. And this is indoctrinated into people. When we're children, our parents are our gods, which makes sense because we learn language from our parents, which is a key part of human existence and evolution. Everything our parents pass on to us, we have no denying that it's true because it's all we're told. And this is one of the most prominent aspects of human nature, I think, is this aspect of trust in what you are being taught by other humans. Now there's a flip side to this, and that's we're capable of critical thought. We're capable of taking anything we're told and then thinking of the opposite and then deciding, hang on, well, does that fit into my mode of the world? Does that fit into what I see? Is that in line with my attitude? Again, we would not have evolved important technological and social structures without thinking critically about both the basic and the complex, which brings it round nicely to a theory unifying these contradictions. The thing about human nature is we struggle. Nature is a constant state of change and struggle. And when we look at any ecosystem, we see the same sort of patterns. Take foxes and rabbits, for example. When there are a few foxes and lots of rabbits, the foxes get more to eat, they breed, they grow in number. Oh, sorry, I confused myself now. Yeah, okay, so when there are a few foxes and lots of rabbits, the foxes get more to eat, they breed, they grow in number, which reduces the amount of rabbits there are to eat, to a point where not all the foxes can eat, and then many foxes die off. This gives the fitter rabbits the breathing space to reproduce, increase in number, and then they become, not the dominant species because they're lower in the food chain, but they become the more numerous species, and then obviously all the foxes have more to eat. And it goes in this kind of cycle of struggle. And essentially the fitter rabbits pull through. Now this constant state of struggle occurs within our own social contracts and even within our own psychology. You know, we're always doubting ourselves, we're always criticising other people as well as ourselves, and we're always getting to this, you know, not always getting to a better answer, but it's evident. This is how we evolved to where we are today, and it's how we'll get to the next stage of our evolution. So I think we should replace this idea that humans are naturally selfish, because within nature it's common to see examples of altruism, whereby an animal acts selflessly to aid another without any benefit to itself. This is very common throughout nature, it's common throughout humans. It's just not something that we're taught is a human trait. So I think let's just stop getting manipulated by the snapshots of Darwinian logic that only really serve to divide us further and halt the progression of our species. That's kind of the end of my speech. My speech. I was going to say another thing actually about that Darwinian logic is the very far right and Hitler, obviously in the 40s, they used this kind of survival of the fittest species, and they you know had this idea of the Aryan master race where the white human was the better species and therefore will conquer all. That's, like I say, a snapshot of Darwinian logic, which it doesn't really have any scientific grounding, because different races of people can breed and mix, and according to the whole Darwinian logic, it's actually this mixture that provides the better species. So this whole, for instance, like breed standards and just having one breed and then just breeding it out and out and out, that destroys the species. So what they've done, or what Hitler done, I mean I didn't know Hitler, but I imagine he took these ideas and then manipulated people with them. Eugenics, yeah. I mean, eugenics was like a complex version of it. But it's these tiny bits of scientific information which they can then say, well, that fits in with my argument that everyone else is not as good as I am, so I'll use it. And then they pass it on to obviously the masses, who then reciprocate this argument. And I just think about, like I said, they take snapshots of logic and use it to manipulate.
It's Nietzsche's philosophy as well that played a massive part in that. The Übermensch.
Wasn't his
Like the superhuman.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jambo.
Superior man.